Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 135 and I am the show's host, Kyle. On this show, I'm going to be talking about some things that happened over Christmas. I know this sounds terrible, but a lot of governments will take advantage of the Christmas holiday, knowing that people are going to be mostly tuned out of the media, busy running around doing family stuff and enjoying themselves. Hell, even I, take a bad seat. I don't stop reading completely, but I definitely spend a little bit of less time on it over Christmas and Christmas Eve and stuff. So I definitely think, big things get pushed to the news. So if you think, you want to catch up now, maybe you got some time off work or whatever over the next couple days, some other people do as well, and they may be bored, think about sharing the show. Tell them to, hey, check it out. Because what I'm going to be talking about today is a lot of really, really important issues. So foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, thelibertarianinstitute.org. It's on the homepage and at /Kyle. Or you could go to Facebook and check out the Libertarian Union, and you could always find my show there. So I'm going to start off today's show, and I want to update what's going on in Yemen, because it looks to me like Saudi Arabia is upping the airstrikes, following Nasser Arabi on Twitter, who I found to be one of the most reliable sources reporting out of Yemen. Although he does seem to have a strong anti-Saudi bias, and I think you should keep that in mind when you read his stuff. But if you look at what Nasser says, a lot of it ends up coming true, even at times where I'm hesitant because I think, wow, this seems to really have a anti-Saudi slant. It ends up being correct anyways, and so it's just that the Saudis are doing things that bad in Yemen. Over the weekend, we have Western media, or over Christmas, even Christmas Day, we have Western media reporting that Saudi Arabia killed about 70 Yemeni civilians. Nasser Arabi puts that number at over 100, I think at 115 to 125. A lot of these civilians being killed are children, and a lot of these killings are single-family homes, and I guess there's just entire families, 14, 15 people live in single-family homes in Yemen. I think this is, part culture and tradition, and part probably because if you're, having a extended family, a lot of other people may have lost their homes to the war and the fighting going on. So anyways, you have all these people in not super large houses or anything like that, and one missile is obviously going to take out and destroy the whole thing. So you have entire families being killed. One of the saddest things is a lot of times you'll see that, maybe it's a whole family or a whole family minus one, and some little 6-year-old girl survives. And, it just seems so horrifying, because then you put yourself in the shoes of that little girl, thinking that you probably saw several members of your family, maimed and dismembered. Hopefully first rescue, responders were on the scene and were able to sweep you away before you realize, everything that was going on immediately. But it must be just the most traumatic life to have that be an event in your past. And so, when this happens, really try to put yourself in their shoes. And this is what's going on right now in Yemen. It's an absolute genocide. There are reports that Saudi Arabia lifted the humanitarian blockade at the port of Hodeidah and the Sana'a airport. It doesn't seem like this has really happened. I have seen reports on Twitter that one fuel ship has made it to the port of Hodeidah. However, I've seen people say, no, that's not true, or maybe it got in, but it hasn't offloaded or something like that. So the idea, though, that there's a lot of aid getting into Yemen right now is an absolute fabrication. And people are continuing to suffer and die, and Saudi Arabia is, like I said, waging this brutal air campaign. With every bomb, they destroy more and more Yemeni infrastructure, and nothing, is really able to get into the country to be able to rebuild all of these things. So I'm sure, that with each additional airstrike, life gets worse for Yemenis by that much more. I also just like to point out that, look at the exploitation of Christmas. The Trump supporters are always out there yelling about the war on Christmas and all this. And here we have a Muslim country who is taking advantage of the Christmas holiday to kill a lot of civilians, knowing that nobody's going to pick it up in the news coverage. And, and there's no demand for Trump to move away from Saudi Arabia. At least not a large one from his base. I guess sometimes I hear a small one from his base. So that's disappointing, and it's absolutely disgusting. Another thing that I believe was done, to be hidden by the Christmas holiday was the United States approved lethal aid to the Ukrainian government. Actually, I guess I should rephrase, because if you read all the reports and everything, they call it defensive lethal aid, meaning that we're going to give the Ukrainians weapons, but they're only going to use it in defense. They're not going to use it in offense. Of course, I guess, to really make this story make sense, you have to rewind back to 2014 when the elected government of Ukraine was overthrown by a U.S.-backed coup. You could listen to the report F the EU. Go to YouTube, search that in. Victoria Nuland announces the coup right there on a recorded phone call, which was later released. Ukraine being a very important ally to Russia, and a lot of ethnic Russians living in Ukraine because of Soviet-era policy. There are a lot of Russians who live in Ukraine, and when they were, forced to move to Ukraine under the USSR, the idea was that the whole thing was Russia, so they really weren't leaving the homeland. And so I think a lot of people who live in eastern Russia and the Crimean Peninsula lived there under the idea that they were Russian and they didn't want to move away from Russia's orbit. And that's what was happening with the U.S. support government. They were looking at, moving towards the NATO orbit, and there was even talks of them joining NATO. So the people in eastern Ukraine start a civil war against the government, realizing it was a coup d'etat and that the democratically elected government was overthrown. The people of Crimea secede and then join the Russian Federation, so Crimea is now a part of Russia, and this it was a reaction to the U.S. coup d'etat in Kiev. A lot of people like to try to bend the narrative and lie and say this was an example of Russian aggression, and whenever somebody in the U.S. government is talking about the situation, what happened in Crimea, they always reference this as a case of Russian aggression, that the Russians went out and stole Crimea. But what really happened is that the United States created a situation for the people in Crimea where they could no longer be a part of Ukraine because they didn't agree with the policies of the government anymore. So now for the first time, since Civil War broke out in 2014, it's been pretty brutal fighting. Luckily for the past, I'd say, year and a half, maybe a little bit closer to a year, there's been a treaty that is more or less held, or a ceasefire that is more or less held there in Ukraine, called the Minsk II Treaty, and I think it's mostly the Western European countries that are pushing the Ukrainian government to remain in the ceasefire, while the United States, even blatantly, we had U.S. Senators John McCain and Lindsey Graham go over there almost a year ago on New Year's and try to stir up the, Ukrainian government's fighting force, some of whom are Nazis, are, honest, open Nazis. I think the leader of the Ukrainian parliament right now is a Nazi. And, and when them, told them it was going to be a year of offense. And so, the United States certainly hasn't really played into this whole idea that they need to remain in the ceasefire like the rest of the Western European countries have. That mainly being led by Germany has been the big voice there. Now, what this is going to do is, the United States is going to provide, I believe, sniper rifles and Javelin missiles. And these Javelin missiles are anti-tank missiles. If you look at what happened in the Syrian civil war, you'll notice that one of the really effective things that the jihadists were able to use the tow tank missiles that were provided to them by Saudi Arabia. And this is because you could destroy all the armored personnel carriers, so it becomes a whole lot harder to move personnel around. Also, I think in places, especially like Syria, where the jihadists didn't necessarily have their own air force, to be able to destroy these armored vehicles with those kind of munitions, this really changes the tide. And I'm sure it's going to be similar in Ukraine when you're able to deploy and destroy their armored personnel carriers. I don't know if this will be, enough to really change the status quo there. It looks to me that I saw some encouraging signs that it wasn't. And as they're moving forward with a exchange of prisoners today between the two sides, I'm encouraged by this because I think if the Ukrainian government had gained a huge advantage from this, maybe they would pull back from doing the prisoner exchange, believing that they now had the upper hand and no longer needed to negotiate. So the fact that, these negotiations and talks and all this process is still going on seems to be encouraging. However, it could encourage Russia to put more weapons into eastern Ukraine too, because the one thing they don't want is, NATO all the way up to their border and Ukraine being a member of NATO. And so if they have to arm the, eastern Ukrainian rebels to prevent that, I guess they will. Also, there's a matter of, don't the rebel groups in East Ukraine and the citizens, the ethnic Russian citizens that live there have their own right to be ruled in the way they want to and not necessarily the way they're being forced to. And so don't they have a right to self-defense? The idea that this is being spun as defensive aid, and I exactly know how it's only defensive. I guess maybe if you gave the missile defense systems or something, like even those could be converted pretty quickly into offensive systems. But, there's no way to guarantee that this is only going to be used for defense. Remember that a lot of the pro-Ukraine government soldiers are Nazis. You're entrust these guys to go out there and be the most honest actors. And, oh yeah, boss, we'll only use these if people are shooting at us first. The conditions of the Ukrainian civil war aren't that you could guarantee that these weapons are only going to be used for defensive purposes. I mean, if you look at the blunder of what happened in Syria, you could obviously see that the United States has no ability to control what happens to our weapons when we give them away. Saudi Arabia is using our bombs to commit genocide in Yemen. Israel is using our weapons to oppress the Palestinians. The jihadists used our weapons in Syria to almost defeat the Assad government. And now, we're going to have a similar situation where we could have the pro-Ukrainian government, if the United States gives them enough aid, maybe take the whole country from the rebels. And then that would put Russia in a position where they feel like they have to act to prevent Ukraine from going to NATO. And so, this news broke in the past couple of days, so that's a big deal just because, everybody's tuned out over Christmas. Nobody wants to think about a bunch of people dying and the awful, horrible geopolitical blunders that Donald Trump is getting the United States into, but these things are going on even while we're, just trying to enjoy a dinner with our families. And this is one of the things that we need to talk about when it comes to U.S. foreign policy, is just that it's an absolute runaway train. The fact that you could get away with the United States joining and upgrading itself in the Ukrainian civil war in the way it has by now providing lethal aid to the Ukraine government, over the Christmas break doesn't really seem very fair, and doesn't seem like the kind of thing that would happen in like a honest, open society or something like that. And so these are the kind of ideas we need to push. The other thing I want to talk about before I wrap up, my allergies are killing me today, so this is probably going to be a pretty heavily edited show. So if it sounds a little broken up and tangential more than normal, it's just because I've been sneezing a lot and having to pause and everything. So last thing I want to cover though, and I think it's really important, is Scott Ritter has published an article in the American Conservative. I will definitely link to it in the show notes page, where he kind of breaks down Nikki Haley's claims to the UN, claiming that Iran violated the UN resolution dealing with the Iran nuclear deal by providing missiles to the Houthis that were used against Saudi Arabia. So the first thing that Scott Ritter brings up is that this was not an Iranian-made missile as Nikki Haley claims. Nikki Haley specifically claims that the missile was a QM-1 missile, but it was not, and that's an Iranian-made missile. It was a Scud missile either from the USSR or from North Korea back in the 1980s. These are the same kind of missiles that Saddam Hussein had and used against America in the first Gulf War. So what the Houthis are doing to these missiles, and I guess, Salah was allied with Houthis when they were upgrading these missiles, is They take the basic Scud missile and the engine from the Scud missile, most of the body from the Scud missile, and then they extended and made some additions and subtractions to it. The new missile that they're able to create, it has more range, I guess, and more accuracy, and it has some more precision guided stuff on it. The new missile upgrade that the Houthis use, upgrading the Scud missiles, also have the warhead separate from the rest of the missile in the final stage of the missile's, trajectory. This means that the missile then, the missile body is a bigger target. And so then the U.S. Patriot missile systems that are in Saudi Arabia to intercept missiles have a very little chance of actually hitting the warhead, which is much smaller. And so I guess this is a way that these missiles are more effective. And this was a problem, once again, for the U.S. in the first Gulf War. Apparently, there is some Iranian tech within these missiles that likely was smuggled into Yemen over the border with Oman. One of the important claims that Nikki Haley makes is that there's Iranian advisors or missile experts helping the Houthis arm and develop these missiles. Scott Ritter makes it very clear that with available information that the Houthis do not need additional assistance from Iran to be able to operate these missiles, and there's no evidence that the parts for the missiles came through the Iranian government, just that they have Iranian markings on them. And so this pokes a lot of huge holes in the case that Nikki Haley made, and it really suggests that the United States is grasping at the straws by asserting, claims that this is a different kind of missile than it is when they have the body of the missile there and absolutely knows what it is. Just shows, that they have absolutely no case that they have to be that dishonest. For those of you who don't know, Scott Ritter is a weapons expert who did a lot of inspecting, I think in the 2003 lead up to the Iraq war, and has done a lot of important work with veteran intelligence professionals for sanity. So, everybody should check out his piece there, The American Conservative, and get all the details. I can't get into all the rocket science on the podcast, but he lays it all out pretty simply too in the article. Alright guys, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show for today. I will be back on Friday with a long show, wrapping up the year of 2017. I hope to have a guest on that show, and hopefully we'll have a lot of fun things to say. I'll try and make the show fun, enjoyable, and something that you can share with people, and that way you get all the information. So, share the show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, the libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle, and then the Facebook page, Libertarian Union. You can find the show at the Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus. I'm on Twitter at KYAAALE. My personal website is kylesfilesblog.com.